Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you had a great week. Actually, just last night, we were able to attend a birthday celebration together with members from all around the world to honor Father and Mother Moon. The late Father Moon would have been 102, and Mother Moon just turned 79. Fun fact, they were both born on the same day according to the lunar calendar, the 6th day of the first month. So happy birthday again, Father and Mother Moon. So last week, we talked about the power of love and principle, how principle without love is cold, but love without principle can be dangerous. God wants us to have both love and principle so that we can experience true love. Today, I wanted to share about the consequences of the human fall and particularly the cumulative effect that original sin has had on humanity. So the title of the sermon is The Sin Effect. Actually, there was one question that was brought to my attention earlier this week. It was, I believe, from Alia. So this message is for you. And by the way, anyone who does have questions, you can always put it in the Facebook, and I might choose one to address during one of the National Family Services. But the question was, how could something that happened so long ago still affect us today? And how can one mistake cause such a negative impact on history? So I wanted to go into that, and the more we understand the source of the problem, the better we will be able to address it. As they say in G.I. Joe, knowing is half the battle. And before you can treat a patient, you need to first have a proper diagnosis of the ailment in order to prescribe the proper treatment. So with that in mind, let's dig into the problem of sin for the sake of humanity. So first, I want to go into the concept of the compound effect. Have you heard about it? It's basically a principle on how small, consistent actions can accumulate into dramatic results. For example, if you look at finances, if you invest $100 every month at 10% interest, 10.5% interest over 10 years, which, by the way, is the S&P 500 historic annualized average return, it will get you $21,500, which is almost 80% more than what you put in. Now, you may say, well, that's okay. It's not that great. But if you do the same thing for 20 years, that number balloons to $82,600, which is 340% of the money that you put in. You go 10 more years to 30 years, that number expands to more than $250,000 just by putting in $100 a month over 30 years. That's 711% more than the money that you actually put in. So with time, the impact grows exponentially. That's if you do it consistently. Now, the opposite is true as well. All of us are familiar with loans, and particularly the 30-year mortgage loan. Let's say you borrow $200,000 for your house at 4%. By the time you're done with paying off the interest, you're going to end up paying $446,000, which is more than double the amount that you borrowed. So again, finances works both ways. If you're investing or if you're borrowing, there is a cost to the amount that you're borrowing. So sin is very similar in that sense. If you look at the compound effect and sin, let's say the original sin was a small mistake. But because it changed a certain mindset from other-centered to self-centered, and because it was so consistent from the very beginning, that transferred also generation after generation. We're talking not just 30 years, but thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of years, basically humanity's history. If you apply the same compound effect to sin, you can imagine the kind of damage consistent sin can do for humanity. So today we're going to go into the 4 kinds of sin which the principle identifies. These are sins that we all have and that has accumulated over time. Let's read. Sin is a violation of heavenly law, which is committed when a person forms a common base with Satan, thus setting a condition for give and take action with him. Sin can be classified into 4 kinds. So there's some key points here. Number 1, the sin is a violation of heavenly law, which basically means that anything that deviates from the original design of love is a sin. It's a deviation, right? Number 2, sin is committed when you form a common base with Satan, setting a condition for a give and take with him. Now, Satan, the term Satan or the devil, may seem like a mythical figure, but evil is very real, right? People do some really bad things. And actually, your conscience knows when you're doing something wrong, right? That's a very clear indicator of if you're committing sin or not, is checking your conscience. The more you engage in sin, the more it takes control or effect over you. I don't know if you're familiar with the comic Spider-Man, but there's a character called Venom, and it's kind of like that. The more you use its power, the more it takes control over you. So, and then the third point is that there are 4 layers of sin, and let's look at each of them closely. The first is the original sin. This sin originated with the spiritual and physical fall of our first human ancestors. It is ingrained in our lineage and is the root of all sins. So we already covered the original sin in detail in previous sermons, but it's basically premature, physically driven, self-centered sexual love. This is what opened, in one sense, Pandora's box and set the path of humanity towards suffering and also godlessness, right? This is why we all have a tendency towards self-centered sexual love. Let's continue. The second is hereditary sin. This is sin which one inherits from one's ancestors on account of their connection through lineage. It is written in the 10 Commandments that the sins of parents will be visited upon their descendants. This is a lesser known layer of sin. Hereditary sin is actually inherited from your ancestors. This means that similar to how you inherit physical traits from your parents or your grandparents, you also inherit spiritual traits from your ancestry. And if you're struggling with a certain kind of sin, it's very possible that your ancestors struggled with the same kind of sin and that you have inherited that same struggle. You know, looking at all my siblings and myself, I would guess that one surface level hereditary sin that we inherited is probably arrogance. We're all very stubborn and we all think that we know best. Let's continue. The third is collective sin. This is sin for which a person is responsible as a member of a group, even though he neither committed the sin himself nor inherited it from his ancestors. An example of this kind of sin is the crucifixion of Jesus. So collective sin is something that most people don't understand. Especially, I think, in America, it may seem very foreign to feel any kind of responsibility for sins that you have not personally committed. However, a good example of the consequences of collective sin and how it manifests is racism and prejudice. For example, let's say your ancestry has been in America for generations, and let's say your ancestors never owned slaves. But the fact that America had slaves during that time that your ancestors were living in America makes you liable for this collective sin of Americans for having slaves. Let's continue to read. Although only the chief priests and certain scribes committed the deed when they sent Jesus to be crucified, the Jewish people and humanity as a whole have together shouldered the responsibility for this sin. So again, according to this example, my ancestors were probably not there when Jesus was crucified. But as humanity, I'm also partially liable for that sin, for being part of humanity, basically. Here's another more direct example. I'm ethnically Japanese. My ancestry are all farmers on my dad's side and probably teachers and educators on my mom's side. And most likely, they never fought directly in a war. It's farmers and teachers. However, historically, Japan fought many wars and occupied other countries like Korea and China and committed all kinds of atrocities which occur in war. Even though I personally or my ancestry were most likely not involved directly in those atrocities, because I'm Japanese, I carry the weight of the collective sin of Japan. With this understanding, I can better digest any kind of prejudice or racism that I experience from an American, Korean, or Chinese person that may hate me just by the way I look or just by the fact that I'm Japanese. The fourth is individual sin, which an individual himself commits. Although we are all influenced by these other three sins, original sin, hereditary sin, and collective sin, we are primarily responsible and accountable for our personal sin. These are the sins that we commit ourselves. We choose to commit, okay? So it's kind of like you can think bad things, you can feel tendencies towards something, but personal sin is when you actually commit a sin yourself, okay? And next week, we're going to go into more detail about personal sin and the four fallen natures that we all need to overcome to address these personal sins. For today's sermon, I want to focus on these other three sins and how we can address the collective, hereditary, and original sin. So, what can we do about these sins? If sin is defined as a violation of heavenly law, what can we do to resolve these violations? Well, 3 days ago, I had to attend a court hearing for a speeding ticket that I received a couple months ago. I ended up hiring a lawyer to help me reduce the points on my license, but I still had to pay quite a fee for the violation on top of the lawyer fee. So it wasn't cheap. But basically, any violation that is made, there is a system in place where you need to pay a fine or go to a class or do some kind of thing to restore what you did wrong. So how do we pay for the violation of heavenly law? Is there a spiritual court hearing that we can attend or a way to pay for our spiritual violations? I'm going to introduce here the principal concept of restoring sin through paying indemnity. Let's read. What then is the meaning of restoration through indemnity? When someone has lost his original position or state, he must make some condition to be restored to it. The making of such conditions of restitution is called indemnity. For example, to recover lost reputation, position, or health, one must make the necessary effort to pay the due price. So indemnity, according to the principle, is simply a condition that you can do to restore a mistake that you made or a sin that you committed. So let's say I made a promise and to my wife about being home at a certain time, and I was late or I didn't show up. Now, because of that, trust was lost, right? I guess you can call that a sin. Breaking a promise, right? And yeah, my conscience felt bad about it. So yeah, so that's a sin, right? So I broke a promise. So in order to restore that, I would need to do something to regain her trust. Either I would have to be on time for the next 10 times, or maybe bring flowers or something to show that I am repentful for the mistake I made and I'm aware of the impact that made on her and made effort where she can feel that trust is restored. So indemnity paying is really a restoration by doing something to pay for the sin that you committed. Okay. So for our collective sin, which again is any sin that we are responsible for collectively that was committed against anyone, even if you or your ancestors were not directly involved, I can share maybe a couple examples. For example, as a Japanese man, by the way, I am an American citizen, but I was born in Japan, so I'm ethnically Japanese. I could apologize to and love a Korean on behalf of Japan for any sins committed by Japan against Korea or Koreans, right? Or as a man, I could apologize to and love my wife representing all women for any sin that men have committed against women throughout history. Alternatively, you could forgive and love someone who has committed a similar sin against you. It's all really about intention. When you get into the spiritual restitution, it's about your intention and your heart with which you do things. So let's read here. If the earthly person gratefully and willingly suffers the work of the evil spirit, he will make the indemnity condition to purge his and his ancestors' sin. Consequently, the spirit will receive the same benefit as the earthly person. So I shared this story, I think in one of my sermons before, but it was third grade. There was a new transfer student, a Chinese girl. And anyway, it was during dodgeball and we weren't even playing, and she just pegged the ball at my head. And she started yelling at me, I hate you, and so on and so forth. Again, I did not provoke her or do anything, so she got in trouble by the gym teacher. But I remember feeling confused, not necessarily angry, but why was she so upset at me? I didn't even know her, right? But I felt a little sorry for her because English wasn't her first language and she was new to the school. So I continued being nice to her, holding the door, helping her feel included, even though sometimes she would be quite mean. I remember one time she publicly disinvited me from her birthday party. It's like, everyone's invited except you. Anyway, this is elementary school. So, but the point is that I think, whether it's spiritual or because of what you were told by your parents, these kind of sins that occurred in the past history, that's what fuels racism and prejudice. Why are Japanese, or if you look at any first generation immigrants, they have a lot of prejudice. And it's because of their life experience and the life experience of their peers and their parents. And there's a certain kind of concept that builds against a certain type of person or certain race or certain nationality. So that's something that we can understand is actually connected to collective sin. I think this is where Jesus' advice about turning the other cheek is valid. In order to break the cycle of hate, someone needs to be willing to love those, even those that hurt them. Otherwise, if each side hates each other each time, that kind of collective sin just continues to grow. Now let's go into hereditary sin. How can we address hereditary sin? So when it comes to hereditary sin, many addictions and negative personality traits can be traced back to your ancestry. Especially if you notice that you have a tendency toward a very particular or specific deviant behavior, it is most likely connected to hereditary sin. So for hereditary sin, I recommend two things. First, seriously deal with it, knowing that it's not just for you, but it's for your ancestors and your descendants. Get professional help. If you're dealing with any addictions, anger management, depression, whatever you don't resolve during your lifetime will be passed on to the next generation. And even if you don't have any children or next generation, right? The fact that you're carrying this kind of hereditary issues means that for those who passed before you, your ancestry and spirit world, they're counting on you to be able to address it, to also liberate them. So it's really important that if you do notice any kind of hereditary issues, that you seek professional help to address them during your lifetime. And number two, secondly, look into spiritual help. We actually have an ancestor liberation ministry which deals with this specifically, where you can offer donations and set personal conditions of prayer and fasting to liberate and bless your ancestors. Again, intention matters when it comes to spiritual matters. So the fact that you are setting some kind of indemnity through prayer, through fasting, through donations, this is actually setting a condition to liberate and address those sins of the past. And finally, the original sin. This one is a tough one. Let's read. The original sin may be thought of as the root of all sins. Hereditary sin as the trunk, collective sin as the branches, and individual sin as the leaves. All sins sprout from the original sin, which is their root. Without extirpating the original sin, there is no way to completely eradicate other sins. So God has been working throughout history to try to resolve this original sin. In fact, that's why God sent Jesus in the first place, to restore the original love of parent and child between God and humanity. That was what was lost. The trust, the obedience, the relationship of love of parent and child was lost at the time of the fall. So Jesus came to restore as the first true son, restore that original relationship between God and humanity as parent and child. And also, that's why God called upon Father and Mother Moon to continue this messianic mission. The Messiah is to come save, right? Restore. Messiah is actually a very restorational role. We'll go into that in a future sermon. But the whole marriage blessing ministry was designed to help with restoring the original sin. So reversing the original curse. Actually, this movement, this marriage blessing movement, addresses the restoration of all four of these sins. And that's why it's so amazing. In terms of the personal sins, there's a lot of preparation for the marriage blessing, where you're purifying yourself through taking the holy wine and rededicating your life to God. In terms of restoring collective sin, the marriage blessing brings couples together from enemy nations, which heals the conflict between countries like America and Japan, Japan and Korea, German, Jewish, white, black. Father and Mother Moon intentionally brought couples from different enemy nations for the sake of bringing about peace, because the children of those unions will be the substantial unification of those two enemy nations. And that was the intention behind these cross-cultural, cross-national, international marriage blessing, was actually for the sake of facilitating peace in this world. As for restoring hereditary sin, there is this chastening ceremony where you repent for all and any sin that you or your ancestors made against the opposite sex. And for restoring the original sin, there's an actual portion, a 43-day process where we reverse the curse of false love by doing exactly what Adam and Eve could not, by obeying God's commandment, going through 40 days of separation, and really engaging in a 3-day ceremony that rededicates your marriage to God. So every aspect of the marriage blessing is designed to address these 4 kinds of sin and really pay indemnity to restore what was lost at the time of the fall. In this way, the marriage blessing is the key sacrament to reverse the original curse and open the doorway for humanity to reconnect as God's original family. So if you look at it that way, no single couple has done more for God, humanity, and the world, and for world peace than Father and Mother Moon through the marriage blessing. So in summary, first, sin has had a negative compound effect on humanity. There are 4 kinds of sin: original, hereditary, collective, and personal. Sin can be restored through setting conditions to pay indemnity. And the marriage blessing movement is designed to restore all 4 kinds of sin. So, brothers and sisters from around the nation and the world, all this talk about sin can definitely be heavy. It actually took longer than usual to prepare this sermon. But the heart behind sharing on this topic is to better understand the spiritual problem that we face so that we can learn to overcome it. As I said in the beginning, knowing is half the battle. Without first acknowledging that we have a problem, there's no way we can address it. And acknowledging the problem is the first step to healing. God is longing for the day when all humanity restores their love relationship with God. And that's why we promote the marriage blessing. It's really the key to reversing the curse of fallen love by inviting God into the most important love relationship, the love between a husband and wife. And that is the foundation for building a loving family, a community, and a peaceful world. May God bless you and your family this week. Thank you.